Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers as we talk Seahawks football. Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers. We're here to talk about some roster moves after the 53-man roster, final roster was set. Teams have been moving back and forth in the background as far as waiver wire acquisitions, and the 16-player practice squad is initially set at, I think, 13 players right now. Some moves to IR to accommodate said moves, and all of it. And we're going to talk about it here in this show. Welcome in, Keith.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. There were a lot of moves made, but none of them were the ones that you and I really talked about yesterday. There's a big gaping roster hole at the moment, and it got bigger today, which is surprising. But there's still more moves to come. And also it's not as big of a deal now as it would have been a couple of years ago, because now guys in the practice squad, they can choose to take a couple of them and elevate them to the roster for game day and then send them back down instantly. They don't have to cut someone to do that like they had to in the past. So having guys on the practice squad actually gives you flexibility on game day now. And
I think something that you and I have talked about privately, but haven't really talked about on the show, maybe we can do that today. And we're talking about the middle linebacker position, specifically for the Seahawks, is fairly light when you take a look at just Jordan Brooks and Cody Barton as the starters. The backup is literally Nick Bellore. If you look at it, as listed on the 53, but you've got the idea that maybe Uchenna Nwasu would move over if somebody could not go there in the middle, and then they would bring up like Alton Robinson to pair with Taylor on the other side, and that would kind of solve their in-game maneuvers to kind of work around that.
The Six don't want to do that because the outside linebacker spot, you want to rotate guys, you want to have guys fresh as best you can. And right now you've got those three guys, Taylor, Robinson, Nwasu, and then you're going to sprinkle in Boye Mafe right now as a situational pass rusher. And, his role will expand over time, but he's not ready for a full big chunk of snaps at this moment. So there's not a lot of, those four guys are all good. But if you remove Nwasu from that group, now you've got two guys, one of which has got a bum ankle and the other one is not ready for full time. Like that's not a place you want to be.
Yeah. And then they've got some, an additional kind of hybrid flexibility there with Jamal Adams and Josh Jones, Ryan Neal. And so you can kind of finagle, for a game, let's just say, to get through something. But yeah, long term,
I expect them to bring in another middle linebacker, though, especially when the guy whose name we said we were going to learn how to pronounce last show got cut. And so now I feel less inclined to learn how to pronounce his name properly because he's no longer with the Seahawks.
He still may come back onto the practice squad.
He might be one of the reasons why they're short on the practice squad is because he was a guy who made the initial 53. But when you release him, now he has to go through waivers so he can be added into the practice squad tomorrow. So they might be holding a spot for him. But at least for right now, I'm off the hook.
And Donker doesn't count. Yeah. Let's go through the practice squad. Donker doesn't count, so they really have got 14 players, but they do have openings for 3 players to be added in total. And the guy that you just spoke of, Onujago, he may well be added, and that would bring it up to 14 and then a couple more spots. Everything's pretty fluid this time of the year. Let's talk about the practice squad. 53 set, we can kind of get into some of that as well. But let's just kind of lay out the practice squad really quick. Sean Mannion was a name that is familiar to some Seahawks fans. He was on kind of the camp roster in 2021 for a little bit. previously quarterback out there for Oregon State, and has been around for a while. I think with Minnesota primarily in the NFL as a backup to Kirk Cousins. And so you've got still Drew Lock and Geno Smith there. Sean Mannion is a quarterback on the practice squad. Jacob Eason moved to the Panthers practice squad, so he's no longer part of the organization at all. Darwin Thompson, one of your favorite guys to be added to the practice squad, was indeed added. Aaron Fuller, Bo Melton, Cade Johnson, and Arcega Whiteside were additions to the practice squad. Tyler Mabry from the tight end group, Greg Island and Liam Ryan from the tackle group were added. Tanner Muse, Vi Jones, and Aaron Donker from the linebackers were added to the practice squad. And Tanner Muse and Vi Jones do have some ability to kind of maybe play a little bit of middle linebacker for the team. Mm-hmm. It'd be less than optimal, obviously, but they're on the practice squad. And Scott Nelson, one of the safeties that they really liked, and Quandre Mosley is a new name that the Seahawks picked up outside the organization to come in and be on the practice squad. He was an undrafted rookie free agent, been floating around a little bit out there with different teams, and he's currently on the squad. And that's it for right now. And then there were a few other roster moves, Keith, if you want to kind of run through those a little bit.
Well, yeah. So, we talked about waivers just briefly there, and that's kind of what happened with Seattle was they claimed a couple players off waivers from other teams, which is why they had to, make a couple roster moves and that happened. But, they drafted or they claimed cornerback Isaiah Dunn and defensive end Daryl Johnson off waivers. And so those were players from other teams that were cut from other teams that never made it to being where a team could sign them to a practice squad because they were claimed and placed on Seattle's 53. So that is where they stand with that. A couple of actually surprisingly decent players. So you've got Dunn, who you might remember locally because he played for Oregon State. Was undrafted, but made the roster last year, played in 12 games, made a start, but then they decided to revamp the position and they signed DJ Reed away from Seattle, drafted Sauce Gardner in the top 5. And now suddenly this guy that was your third or fourth option at corner becomes your, 5th or 6th option at corner. And there just wasn't a roster spot left for him. So he gets cut and Seattle grabs him. And then, with Daryl Johnson, he was a 7th round pick for the Bills back in 2019. So he hasn't been in the league that long either. He's got 2 sacks, 5 quarterback hits in 2 seasons. And then he was released. So he's a guy that can play defensive end. He can play outside linebacker. He's kind of the way Darrell Taylor was a year ago, where he's playing outside linebacker is gonna be a learning curve for him because he's been more of a 4-3 defensive end. He doesn't really fit the 3-4 defensive end role, but he can do it a little bit. He looks like he's going to be a situational guy. But given that the team had to place LJ Collier on injured reserve, having another guy that can help fill in and take some snaps here or there is not a bad thing.
Yeah, interesting. And they did re-sign Justin Coleman, just announced a couple minutes before we pushed record. Justin Coleman's back on the roster, and LJ Collier moved to IR, as you mentioned. Now LJ Collier is eligible to come back within 4 games, and that's why they did that maneuver there with Justin Coleman initially being cut. It sounded like
we talked about that yesterday.
He was always going to be back, and then Collier would be the move to make that happen.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday because when you have younger players and they get cut, they have to go through waivers, which means if another team wants them, they claim them. And that's what happens. That's how the Seahawks got Dunn and Johnson. With veteran players like Coleman, they don't go through waivers. They just instantly become free agents. So I'm sure that it was all set up. They said, hey, if another team calls you and offers you money, you could take it. But we're going to bring you back. Like, this is just for this because you don't have to go through waivers. So we're going to cut you today. We'll re-sign you tomorrow and we're good to go. And they've done that before. They did that with Tavares Jackson at quarterback a couple of years ago, where they cut him, and then re-signed him a couple of days later. It happens. I mean, you got vets. They've got their spot, but you need to be able to manipulate getting guys onto injured reserve with the ability to return rather than getting them on injured reserve and ending their season. Sometimes you got to do this stuff.
So no big surprises. Really, not at this point. The only surprise really is just the lack of the depth there at middle linebacker that has not yet been addressed at all. I expect that to be addressed at some point, and it just may not be week one. This could be just some flexible here for the next few weeks.
I mean, 24 hours ago they were short at linebacker in total with 7 total linebackers. And no, I don't count Nick Ballore as a linebacker because he's not good. He's there to be special teams and nothing else. And then they cut
Joshua.
I'm not going to try.
Joshua.
They have 6 linebackers on the roster, one of which is Robinson, who's nursing a sore ankle. Right, so you've got no depth whatsoever. And your 6 linebackers, and you play 4. Right, they're in a 3-4 now. You're going to 4 of those guys are going to be on the field for a lot of snaps, and I mean
so they look like they're depending on their practice squad guys to come up and elevate during game day, which is kind of interesting. And maybe they feel that way about Vi Jones. I don't know. I mean,
or Tanner Muse. I mean, Tanner Muse was a 3rd round pick. So let's not think that he doesn't have any kind of talent or anything like that. He was a 3rd round pick. And so yeah. I will say that one of the things that if you look back at the 2019 draft for Seattle, which had Ugo Amadi, who got traded, Marquise Blair, who they cut, and it didn't sound like Pete Carroll was interested in bringing him back, and LJ Collier, who's been kind of a bust and made the roster, but then only to go to IR. Like, that draft class is looking.
I thought the Ugo Amadi and the Blair picks at the time were outstanding.
Blair looked great for for a while.
That's tough. And the Collier thing was a head scratcher from the very beginning. I honestly just do not think that he was the pick. And they, out of desperation, they lost their guy Gary. I think is probably who they were going for, or one of those guys. It looks like Bo Melton. Cleared waivers, made it to the practice squad. That's good for Bo. A 7th round draft pick by Seattle, which means that all the draft picks are retained. Yeah.
Yep. Seahawks had 0 players who they cut get claimed by other teams.
And that didn't surprise me.
Really?
Freddie Swain, maybe. Marquise Blair, maybe, but that was it, right?
Those were the guys, because you have 2 guys that have proven on-field production that are young and still on rookie deals. Blair has not played much, but he has played a couple of games in the beginning of each of the last 2 seasons and looked good. And Freddie Swain was productive last year. Yeah, he wasn't great in camp and stuff this year, but he was a productive player. What
do you think happened to Freddie Swain? I mean, shoot, he was all primed and ready to go take a step up, maybe add another 15, 20 catches to his season totals and a few more touchdowns, and just kind of have a more prominent role. And it was ready made for him in this offseason. The team was literally searching for a 3rd wide receiver that they could count on, after Swain was the 4th guy last year, 3rd, 4th guy. And and everyone was injured and dropping passes all offseason, and it was just there for him to take, and he just did not.
And he didn't. It's really odd to me, because he was the team's 3rd option. I think the team wanted him to be the 4th option, but Eskridge couldn't get on the field ever, so he was the 3rd option, and he was productive. But in training camp, he didn't look good and missed some time, and then didn't look good, and then didn't do anything in the preseason, and found himself not on the roster. It is a head scratcher, and I don't know what to think. Like, because guys don't get worse, significantly worse at football after their second year, going
unless
into their
it's
third.
just a mental thing where he just didn't show up ready, didn't do the work in the off season.
Yeah,
Who knows?
maybe.
Who knows? Got paid. Stuff happens. Any other position groups that look like we need to scour practice squads or other waiver players to bring in? I'm just looking at this thing. I'm not happy about the way the quarterback room looks, but it is what it is. I think you combine the Drew Lock, Geno Smith, Sean Mannion quarterback situation for the Seahawks, and I kid you not, it's probably one of the worst quarterback rooms. I'm going to get nailed on our YouTube channel comment section for this. But
where? Find me one that's worse. Find me a worse situation than Seattle right now at quarterback. You're not going to find one. You're genuinely not, because people will say, well, like, look at Houston. Yeah, they've got a guy in the second year in Davis Mills that shows a lot of promise, and they're at least going to see what he's got this year. What is Seattle? Does Seattle have that young guy that shows a lot of promise? No. They've got an old guy who's 34, and he's going to be starting, even though he's nothing more than a journeyman career backup. And Drew Lock, who is a failed second-round pick.
Yes.
That's been bounced by two teams now. So that's it. And Sean Mannion, who's been around the league for a few years and been a backup and nothing else.
Right. Well,
I kind of liked Mannion coming out. Not that I ever expected him to do great. I thought Kirk Cousins was kind of his ceiling, if he could get there, which so was fitting that he was backing up Cousins for the last couple of years. But I didn't hate him coming out. There was parts of his game that you could like. But he's not a guy you're going to count on as a starter.
Yeah. Interesting.
Not if you want to win.
I think one of the reasons why they picked up Isaiah Dunn at cornerback too is that there's reports out now that Sidney Jones is yet to recover from his month-long concussion battle. Yeah. And that's got to be concerning for the team.
Well, that actually would make sense too, because that puts you with Artie Burns and Tariq Woolen as your starters. And Sidney Jones was expected to be the number one, and then those other two guys fighting for the number two spot. Well, now they're both playing, and you kind of just need bodies. So getting a guy like Dunn, who's got experience, started a game, played in 12 games, so they were able to get him into the rotation and part of the defense last year. Yeah, it's a good spot for the Seahawks to be able to get a guy like that.
So Jason Myers still has a job. We talked about that.
I really didn't see anyone get cut that was going to push him.
Yeah.
None of the guys that could have taken Jason Myers' job ended up on the waiver wire. So, yeah. I
was kind of surprised Seattle brought back Aaron Fuller to the practice squad, where a couple preseasons he just didn't get the job done. So that's a little interesting to me. Cade Johnson, that muff punt cost him a job on the 53, but they brought him back onto the practice squad. That's good. Arcega Whiteside, I guess, showed enough upside where they're going to keep him on the shadow roster for a little bit anyway. That's interesting. That's about it. Tanner Muse, I like that pick. Vi Jones, those two were obvious picks to be on the practice squad. Scott Nelson was the guy that they felt like over Deontay Williams to be on the squad. So other than that, I mean, it just seems like we're ready to go. Yeah, into the season. We got a couple of weeks of practice, and
then they can go get this team can go do their best to stop Russell Wilson from destroying them. I think the defense can get the job done. I don't believe in Seattle's offense enough to think they're going to win that game, but we'll get more into predictions and previewing that game as we go forward.
Yeah. Well, I think let's just get out of here. Let's call this one as a short show and just a nice update on the practice squad. Didn't have really any other information. We just put out a show yesterday talking about the 53, so that's fairly well set. We're going to come back with a special show that we're going to record this weekend with guest Dan Viennes of the Field Goals podcast, previously of the Dan Cave and the Emerald City Sportscast, and Dana O'Gorman of Archer Football, as well as a contributor over at Hawk Blogger. both going to be joining us on the show. We're going to talk about off-season stuff, the 53-man roster. We're going to do a little forecasting as far as how we see the season kind of shaping up with the new quarterback, Geno Smith, and we'll talk about the rookies and how everyone performed in this preseason. And it should be a fun show and give them an opportunity as well to promote their new show and new pairing over there at Field Goals. So that'll be good. Anything else, Keith?
No, when we planned today's show, it was expecting that there was going to be some roster moves and some things to talk about. And it just, the big signing, the big thing, it just never materialized. So, let's get out of here.
Yeah. So we'll come back this weekend and hopefully by then we'll have tons to talk about. Of course, we always do with 4 people in the room. It'll be who can shut up first. So, all right. So let's get out of here. Find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NWC Hawk. The show's a Hawks Playbook, and you can find us on your favorite podcast platforms and YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NWC Hawk. Keith is at Myers NFL. And the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.